Hey there, my friends. Thanks for joining me for another conversation about what it means to be disciples of Jesus, people who are shaped by God's Word to have both the character and the competencies of Jesus, as we delve into this rich Christian life that we find both gathered in celebration and scattered to the places where we live and work and play. We're the church in both places, and as we invest in the relationships that God has given us for this life, both with Him and with other people around us. In a little while, we're going to delve into a new segment that we've kind of lovingly entitled Ask Shell 5. What does it look like to be a Christian family, and especially what does it look like in a pastor's family, doing ministry together? Like I've told people before, we don't have it all figured out, but people don't need a perfect example. They need a living example, and so we're going to give you a little window into what it means to do life in our household, and we're talking a little bit about our values. We talk about, in Shell 5, we reflect God's love, we're stronger together, we celebrate each other, we look before we leap, and we welcome others. And you'll hear us talk about that in a little bit. For the time being, we're looking at Acts chapter 24 as we continue to mine this story, the annals of the early church, as it were, for insights into how we are called to be the church of the 21st century. And we find Paul in Caesarea, under the watchful care of Felix, the governor there, and he's asked to give a defense of what he has done. And people have come from Jerusalem, the Sanhedrin, and a lawyer who is kind of flattering towards the governor, overly flattering, if you want to be perfectly honest, about his character, to try to accuse Paul of causing an uprising and a riot, and that he's profaned the sanctuary. This is kind of consistent with what started the whole thing in the first place, but their real goal is to get Paul back into their custody and to silence him, really, permanently, if that's possible. And so the charges are read out, and Paul answers the charges pretty clearly, but the one that really is kind of the sticky one is what he believes and teaches and confesses, and how it differs from what he's always done as a faithful Jew. Because again, he sat at Gamaliel's feet. He was one of his best students, and he was the one who actually persecuted the church and was a strong proponent of Judaism. So why the change? I think Acts 24 verses 14 and 15 do a pretty good job of laying out Paul's defense for what he believes and teaches and confesses. He says, "But I admit this to you. I worship the God of my ancestors according to the way," that's a way of talking about Christianity, "which they call a sect, believing believing everything that is in accordance with the law and written in the prophets. I have a hope in God, which these men themselves also accept, that there will be a resurrection, both of the righteous and the unrighteous. I always strive to have a clear conscience toward God and men." So one of the things that I think is helpful to mention in the midst of all of this is that Paul's witness is consistent across all of his teaching and preaching. He makes the connections to Judaism. When he goes in synagogues throughout Asia Minor to start churches there, he starts with the things that everybody can agree upon. And here also, he builds upon the foundation of Judaism. But he sees Christianity and Christ as the fulfillment of Judaism and the prophecy about the Messiah. So he's not throwing the Old Testament out. And Felix, having married a Jew, and kind of being very understanding of not just the theology, but also some of the politics involved, calls Paul back over and over again in the time that he's tenured there in Judea, in Caesarea. And it seems like in some ways he's interested, but he's also probably interested in a bribe. That's kind of what we find out when all is said and done. Verse 26, when he's at the same time, he was also hoping that Paul would offer him some money, a bribe to get him out of jail, basically. So there's a lot of external forces here that Paul has no control over. And yet, what Paul Maier says in the fullness of time is at this time, Luke probably took this opportunity to, the proximity to Jerusalem, to go back there, to interview some of the eyewitnesses, the key witnesses of Jesus' story, so that he could write his gospel later. So once again, consistency in message is really important, the connection to the Old Testament, and that God uses all the external circumstances to line things up so that his word and his story is told well. I think that's something we can find comfort in, that even though we don't always have control of the things around us, that God is always lining conversations up for us, whether we can see them right now or not. And I hope you find some encouragement in that. I'm going to hand it over to my family, and I'll be right back with you.
All right, so we're here for the first of Ask Shelf 5 that we're doing for the next couple of days, and we've got the whole crew gathered together today. And the first question that someone submitted to us was about little phrases or sayings that you might hear in our house. And so, of course, Shelf 5 was the first thing that we had thought of naturally. And so do you guys remember the first time we started calling ourselves Shelf 5?
Yeah, isn't it when we were at Disney World for the first time?
It was. We were on a family vacation in 2014, and we were having a rough moment. Anybody ever have a rough moment on a family vacation? And we needed to regroup. And I remember telling everybody in the hotel room, all right, we're going to put hands in, and on the count of 3, we're going to say Shelf 5. And it just kind of came.
It just kind of stuck. Yeah.
And it did stick. And so that was a number of years ago, almost 6 years ago, that we have been using that. And it was not until about a year or so after that we sat down together as a family and came up with a list of values. And we have them hanging in our house. And so something that we do say often is our values. And it goes a little something like this.
When we put our hands in, everybody hands in. 1, 2, 3, Shelf 5! And then I always say, in Shelf 5, we reflect God's love.
We're stronger together.
Celebrate each other. We look before we leap. And welcome others, right?
Right. And so after a process, after some work of sitting at the table and all writing things down that were special and important to each of us about what it means to be part of this family, those values came out of that. And we have used those in our house to shape a lot of conversations that remind us of who we are and why we do the things that we do. We use it in tough times too, when we recognize that we're struggling and need to be reminded of what's important to us. So we go to our values a lot. But if I'll just ask the kids one thing, is there anything you guys feel like you hear us say often?
I love you.
Oh, that's a good one.
We say that a lot. Well, my friends, that's all I've got for you for today. So for the time being, as I always say, stay connected to God's word and his promises that never fail. Be well, look out for your neighbors and those around you, and I will see you next time. God's peace to you. Pastor out.